dare you treat me like I don't exist? You don't deserve a place at this table.
This house follows my rules.
And in that silence, one question filled the room: will truth or greed prevail here? This was only the beginning. What came next was more shocking. If you believe in justice, type it in the comments and subscribe. Rain threaded the morning like fine stitches across the old brick of Maggie Dawson's little house in Portland, soft enough to hear and steady enough to fill the rooms with a hush. She moved the way someone does when the day has already been practiced 1,000 times, warming the kettle, measuring coffee by feel, setting the mug on the windowsill where the yard puddled into mirrors. The neighborhood was quiet in the way winter neighborhoods often are, cars tucked along the curb, lights slow to switch on, a delivery truck yawning past and leaving a smell of diesel and wet cardboard. She watched for a while, counting not minutes but sips, the mug a small hearth in her hands. No clocks chimed, no voices carried from another room. What passed for company was the framed photograph of Henry on the bookshelf, his soft smile steady as ever. She would catch herself answering him sometimes, a sentence under her breath, about the weather, about the price of blueberries, about the ache in her shoulder that came and went like a tide. By late morning the rain thinned to a lace of mist. Maggie slipped on her navy cardigan and checked the small stack of mail she set aside the night before. Circulars promising discounts on spiral hams, a flyer for a churchcraft bazaar, a handwritten note from a neighbor saying thank you for watering her azaleas back in August. She left the coupons on the counter, kissed her fingers and touched Henry's frame, then reached for her coat and stepped into the damp air. The street smelled of cedar and cold iron. A crow hopped along the telephone wire, scolding nothing in particular. She locked the door and walked a few blocks to the corner cafe that remembered her order. Inside it was warm and humming. A barista with a silver ring in his eyebrow called out "Good morning" with the cheerful professionalism of someone who has said "good morning" many hundreds of times and still means it. Maggie asked for a small drip and a splash of cream. The same combination the cafe had begun to prepare when they saw her step onto the sidewalk. She left a tip folded neatly beside the saucer, 2 single-dollar bills tucked under the jar so they wouldn't flutter away each time someone reached in. From her table she could see the window fog and clear, each time the door opened. Students in puffer jackets, a man with a muddy dog, 2 women comparing recipes on a phone, laughing at the disaster of last year's gingerbread roof. Maggie smiled without quite realizing it. She wasn't lonely so much as untethered, the way a boat feels when the dock line slips loose and the water has more say. On the walk home, she traced the storefronts she knew by heart. The thrift shop with winter coats lined shoulder to shoulder like a small choir, the hardware store with the bell on its door, the florist steaming up the glass with buckets of evergreens and red berries. She paused at the crosswalk, waited for the chirp that signaled walk, and crossed with a careful, unhurried stride. Her body had become a book of small instructions over the years. Lift your foot, place it down, check the curb, breathe. By the time she turned onto her street, a breeze had gathered. The oak leaves against the sidewalk were slick and paper-thin, and somewhere a radio played an old standard she could not name but knew in her bones. Back inside, she hung her coat, turned on the lamp with a warm shade, and sat at the kitchen table with her planner and a pen that laid down ink like a vow. She wrote 3 lines for the day because 3 felt manageable. Sweep the back steps, call the pharmacy, finish the paragraph about winter mornings. Across from the planner, a braided rug held the impressions of her feet like a secret map. She stood to rinse her mug, then stayed there in the easy music of running water, thinking about the last holiday she had spent with a room full of family, the chorus of tissue paper, the camera flashes, the tree whose ornaments matched like soldiers. Memory rises when the house grows quiet. It does not ask permission. She saw herself walking through a door that smelled of cinnamon and pine, carrying pies she had baked before sunrise, hoping the recipe had not betrayed her and the crust would hold. She saw, too, what came later. The way her name did not appear when gifts were passed and passed and passed, how the children had been swept under a happy tide of boxes and cries of look at this and try that, while she sat with her hands folded just so smiling in a way that hit the sting. She had wished them for nothing, grant only for someone to look up and say, "Here, this one is yours. We did not forget you." The wish had not come. By the time she had let herself out into the night, the yard glittering with lights, the air so bright it felt like ice, she had learned a lesson she had not wanted to learn. Sometimes the rooms you have built with your love do not remember your name. She shook the image from her mind the way a person shakes rain from a coat, slow, steady, practical. The day at hand had tasks in it, and tasks were faithful companions. She swept the back steps as promised, watering can balanced against her hip, and cooed at the neighbor's cat when it appeared on the fence as if from a trapdoor. She called the pharmacy and listened to the recorded voice list options in a polite order, pressed the right number, and thanked the human voice that eventually arrived. She fixed herself a modest lunch soup warmed in a small pot, 2 crackers, a wedge of apple, and ate it at the same kitchen table, the same lamp flickering once and then correcting itself, the rain returning and then withdrawing as if the sky could not make up its mind. In the living room, the bookshelf held not just Henry's photograph, but the sturdy spines of novels, gardening guides, and the journal where Maggie had been sketching out notes for a winter essay. She pulled the journal into her lap and let the pen find its path. She wrote about the way early December sits at the shoulder of the year like a thoughtful friend, about the kindness of thicker socks, and the way steam rising from a kettle looks like a prayer you could actually see. She wrote about reading recipes simply for the reassurance that everything had an order, that you could do one thing and then the next, and end up with something warm and good. She wrote without mention of family or the sharp places. Those belonged to another page, not this one. The phone, face down on the arm of the chair, buzzed once like a small bird striking the window. She glanced toward it, finished her sentence, no sense losing the rhythm, then reached for the device and flipped it over. The screen lit her palm in winter light. A name she had not seen in a long time sat there as if it had every right to appear. Vanessa. For a moment, she did not breathe at all. There is a unique quiet that follows recognition. It is less absence than a gathering of everything important into one still place. She did not answer immediately. She let the sound run its gentle course while she watched the tiny pulse of the call icon, a heartbeat not her own. Then she set the phone down again to steady herself with a sip of water. Her first thought was mistake, her second was obligation, her third shy as a small animal was hope. When the ringing stopped, she waited, as if waiting might keep the world from tilting. And then the voicemail icon appeared with the small, insistent certainty of a blinking lighthouse. She did not press play. Instead, she went to the kitchen and wiped down the already clean counter, rinsed the cup again, opened the drawer where she kept rubber bands for no particular reason, and closed it. The phone buzzed a second time, this time a text. She returned to the chair and stood with her hand on the back of it, the way a person might stand behind a pulpit before speaking. The text was short and formal. Vanessa said hello, named herself, and then wrote that the family had been talking and would like Maggie to come to Seattle for Christmas. The children had been asking, she said. They would love to have her. Maggie read the lines twice, then a third time, because a third time can sometimes reveal what the first two hide. The words were gentle and pleasant. All edges sanded down. But the voice in her chest, the voice she had earned, sat up and asked a simple question. Why now? From the mantel, Henry's smile held. Maggie sat and let the room take a breath around her. She could feel the old ache tugging at the fringes, the one that liked to whisper a cruel story about being unimportant, and she told it, politely, to wait its turn. She had learned other things in the years since the last invitation. Things about making a life out of the materials you have at hand, about turning quiet into a workshop rather than a punishment. She thought of the planner on the table, the essay on winter, the soft machinery of a day put to good use. She thought of how, all at once, one decision can change whether a house is a shelter or a hiding place. She stood and crossed to the small desk where her envelopes lay in a tidy stack. In the top drawer was a document she had printed some days earlier, not as a weapon but as a record, a way to say to herself, you did this with your 2 hands. She touched the corner of the pages, then let them rest. There would be time to consider what to bring and what to leave behind. For now there was the matter of a message to answer and the air around her full of rain and light. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Words gathered and scattered and gathered again, like birds choosing a wire. She typed and erased, typed and paused. Outside, the street lamp flashed on early, washing the wet pavement with a soft glow. And the neighbor across the way lifted a porch wreath to his door and stepped back to consider if it was straight. Somewhere radio changed songs. The new one a melody from another decade. Maggie felt the hush of a threshold forming beneath her feet. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wool. The phone warmed her hand. Maggie gripped the phone, torn between hesitation and hope. Maybe this year will be different, or just the same. The phone rang again while the last of the afternoon light was thinning across Maggie's kitchen, and this time she answered before it could tip back into silence. Vanessa's voice arrived, polished and bright, like a ribbon tied a little too tight. She said hello as if they had spoken last week, named the children, mentioned how busy the season had become, and then moved to the reason for the call. They had been talking, she said, and the kids had been asking, would Maggie come up to Seattle for Christmas? The words were gentle, arranged with care, and yet they felt to Maggie like furniture moved half an inch off center, close to right, but not resting. She leaned a hip against the counter and watched the kettle steam drift, giving Vanessa space to finish the script. Of course it had been too long. Of course they should all be together. Of course it would mean so much to everyone. Maggie heard the pleases and the would loves and the it's times, and somewhere behind them, like a faint second station on the old radio, she heard the question she could not quite ask. Why now? She kept her reply simple, because simple was safer. Thank you, she said. And it has been a while. And let me think about that. Vanessa filled the small gap with more agreeable words, her tone all soft edges and no weight. Christopher did not come on the line. Vanessa said he was tied up with something, and the phrase floated there between them without an anchor. Maggie imagined him in his office, the blue cast of a screen against his face, his thumb busy, his eyes lifted only when the conversation was already ending. She could picture the house too, though she had not stepped inside it in years. A kitchen with hard, clean angles, a living room where the tree would stand in perfect symmetry, each ornament placed as if part of a grid. Seattle rose in her mind's window with its slick streets and bright storefronts, and the lake holding the city's lights like a shallow bowl. When the call ended, the room felt briefly larger, as if someone had opened the door at the far end and pulled in a colder draft. Maggie stayed where she was, the phone warm in her hand, the kettle muttering to itself. She set the device face down and steadied herself with the sound of water pouring, with the faithful work of a spoon circling a cup. Memory came not as a rush, but as a slow tide, and she let it wash the tiles under her feet. She saw the birthday that had marked her 70th year, a day she had once thought would be a small chorus of calls, and turned out to be a long, unbroken line of quiet. The afternoon had stretched, and she had watered the plants, and straightened the silverware drawer, and checked the mailbox more than once, telling herself each time that she had only stepped outside for the air. When dusk finally reached in and found her, she had set a single candle at the table, not to celebrate, but to keep the room from going flat. She remembered the way the wick had taken the flame without hesitation, as if that were its one clear purpose in the world, and she remembered thinking that perhaps that was what she needed, one bright task to hold that did not depend on someone else remembering her name. She refused to let the ache write the story. She walked to the front room and settled in her chair, the one that had learned the shape of her shoulders. She let her breath find a calm pace and then lifted the phone again, not to replay the call in her head, but to imagine the days ahead if she chose to go. She pictured packing a small suitcase, the gray sweater that felt like a companion, the book with the folded page, the tin of tea that always tasted like a good decision. She pictured arriving in Seattle under a sky the color of wet slate, stepping into a house whose walls could make a person feel both impressed and misplaced. She pictured the children's quick hellos and the efficient warmth of Vanessa's welcome and Christopher's careful nod. She pictured her own voice, steady and measured, doing its best to carry itself across the distance of a long table. The kitchen clock ticked without hurrying. Outside, a car eased to the curb and idled, the kind of sound that makes you guess at other people's errands. Maggie thought of Emily, the oldest, the one who used to send pictures of drawings and ask what books her grandmother loved and felt a small thread tug where the heart keeps its truest ties. She did not want to go as a supplicant. She wanted to go as herself. That distinction mattered more than the miles between Portland and Seattle. It mattered more than decorations and menus and the choreography of polite conversation. It mattered like a spine matters to a body. She rose and crossed to her writing desk beside the window. The glass carried a faint print of her hand from earlier in the day where she had leaned in to look at the sky. She opened the top drawer and considered, for a breath, the envelope she had tucked there earlier in the week. She had printed the pages without fanfare, each sheet a small census of the life she had built when no one was watching. She did not lift the packet now, did not fan the pages or weigh them against her palm. She simply touched the corner with one finger, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth of her days had a shape and a weight no one else had assigned. Back at the table, she typed a message to Vanessa that neither chased nor hedged. She wrote that she would come, and she left it at that. No emojis, no exclamation points, just the plain dignity of yes. The bubble turned to delivered, and then to seen. Vanessa's reply arrived quickly. How wonderful, how perfect. The kids will be thrilled. And Maggie let those words pass through her like wind through pines. She did not need to hold them. She needed, instead, to hold herself. Evening pressed closer to the windows. She drew the curtains and clicked on the lamp. A small sun rising in her own private weather. She set the kettle on again and tucked the tea bag into her favorite mug, the one with a faded line of wildflowers along the rim. She put a sweater into the laundry basket for the morning and checked the back door and turned the deadbolt with a sure hand. The house answered, as it always did, with the soft creaks of a structure settling into night. In a chair, with steam lifting into the lamplight, she rehearsed nothing. She did not draft imaginary speeches or load her pockets with perfect lines. She allowed herself a single promise: to keep her voice even and her back straight, and to let her eyes meet whoever looked at her without flinching. There was power in not asking for anything more than respect. There was power in the distance she could keep if the room once again turned away. She stood then and went back to the desk, not to take the envelope, but to make sure her small suitcase would be easy to reach. She thought of the interstate like a long sentence, of the rest stop coffee that was never as bad as people claimed, of the way the city would rise and spread and accept her car into its current. She thought of the tree that would be waiting and of the voices that would circle it, of the polished floor and the photogenic wreath and the way light does what it does on a room full of faces. Her mouth shaped a few silent words, the kind of words a person says to line up their courage. The house held them with her, practiced and loyal. She reached to turn off the lamp, then paused as if listening for something more, and found only the good, playing heartbeat of her own resolve. She whispered, almost amused at how steady it sounded. They think I just sit and wait. They have no idea. Dawn gathered itself into a pale ribbon along the rooftops when Maggie locked her door and carried her small suitcase to the car, the morning air cool enough to make each breath feel clean. The street was still damp from night rain, and the engine's first cough broke the quiet like a polite throat clear. She eased onto Interstate 5 and let the road unwind, the city blocks giving way to long stretches of fir and cedar that stood like a listening congregation. Windshield wipers kept time, a soft metronome, while the radio hummed low behind her thoughts. She drove with the steady patience of someone who had learned to let miles do their calming work, hands light at 10 and 2, jaw unclenched, eyes moving in an easy rhythm from mirrors to lane to horizon. In the passenger seat, a small toad held a book with a folded page, a tin of tea, and her leather-bound notebook with a fountain pen tucked inside like a promise. As Portland receded, the highway gathered more company delivery vans, families in packed SUVs, a motorcycle that stitched in and out of traffic with a bright-throated sound, each traveler carrying a private reason for going. She thought of Vanessa's voice, how its smoothness had felt a touch too polished, and of Christopher's absence from the call, a silence that weighed more than words. Emily appeared in her mind the way sunlight appears when clouds separate, quick, sincere, unforced, and the memory steadied her. Somewhere after the river crossings, the sky thinned to a pearl gray sheet, and the forest pressed closer to the road. Sign after sign announced exits like beads on a string, and through it all, Maggie felt that old, half-stinging, half-fading sentence from years ago when Vanessa, laughing softly at the gleam of a new machine, had said, "You probably just want tea, not the fancy coffee." The line had been dressed as a kindness and had landed like a dismissal. Today the memory arrived without bite. It hung in the car for a moment and then went out the vent, the way a draft slips from a room once you find the seam. Near midday, she followed a blue sign to a roadside diner with a big window fogged by heat and bacon-scented air that clung to coats like an embrace. A server in a cheerful apron wrote down her order, and soon a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee sat before her, simple and sufficient. The vinyl seat sighed when she shifted. Across the aisle, two men in work boots compared notes about a new app that made it easy to sell crafts from a phone. At the counter, a woman scrolled through a recipe for a gingerbread house and laughed at a comment about gravity and frosting. Maggie listened without leaning in, glad to be among people whose lives warmed the room by existing. When the check came, she left a tip in bills and thanked the server by name because names matter. Before returning to the road, she stepped into the bright chill and rolled her shoulders, feeling the good pull of muscles that had spent a morning behaving. Back behind the wheel, the afternoon drove itself into a soft groove. Trees gave way now and then to glimpses of water and barns and billboards declaring 100 urgencies that did not belong to her. She clicked off the radio and let the car's hum fill the space where news might have gone. At the rest area, she parked beneath a bare-limbed maple and wrote 3 lines in her notebook. A sentence about how highways string towns together like beads, a sentence about the taste of diner coffee being better than its reputation, and a sentence she underlined. Do not let their old story become your new one. She capped the pen and sat for one slow breath with her eyes closed, not to sleep, but to let the day fall into its proper rhythm again. Freight trucks sighed by, long exhalations, and the father hurried the child toward the restroom with the patience of someone promising there would be snacks after. Back on the interstate, signs for Seattle began to appear with increasing certainty, and traffic thickened into the kind of choreography that asks for attention without panic. She drove as if the car itself knew where to go, keeping polite distance, letting others merge, letting the lanes tell her what was next. When the first real cluster of buildings rose ahead, she took an exit for gas and pulled into a station where holiday wreaths had been hung on the pump canopies, their green circles patient under the gray. While the tank filled, she cleaned the windshield with a squeegee, pushing water and road dust into neat arcs until the glass looked as honest as the air. She caught her reflection in the driver's window, a woman in a navy sweater and a warm coat, hair tucked back, eyes clear, and looked at herself the way one looks at a friend who has arrived right on time. She smoothed the sleeve, checked that her tote was zipped, and stood a moment longer, letting the breeze cool her cheeks. "I'm ready," she said, not loudly and not as a dare, but as a simple statement of fact that felt good in her mouth. She drove the last miles with the steadiness of someone finishing a well-plotted chapter, the lanes braiding and unbraiding, the city gathering itself, downtown glass lifted like pale water, the lake widened into view in sudden, silver glints between buildings. She thought briefly of the house near the water where the table would be long, and the chairs would be sleek, and there would be a place for her, somewhere, whether or not anyone had bothered to picture her in it. Her hands stayed calm on the wheel. She did not rehearse speeches. She did not compose clever lines. She let the truth of who she was sit in the seat beside her, weighty and companionable. At a final stoplight, a cyclist in a yellow jacket wheeled to a halt and nodded at a dog waiting obediently on the sidewalk. A bus arrived with a soft sigh. A woman in a navy peacoat balanced a bakery box as if it contained the day's entire luck. The light changed, and the car moved forward with the quiet authority of a decision made and kept. From afar, the Space Needle's silhouette emerged, signaling the showdown ahead. The house near Lake Union glowed like a showroom, every window trimmed in white light, every evergreen sprig arranged as if a photographer might arrive at any minute. Maggie stood on the slate front step for one breath to settle her shoulders, then ran. Vanessa opened the door with the kind of smile that photographed well, You made it, she said, stepping aside with a sweep of her arm that felt more like choreography than welcome. Inside, the air smelled of roasted turkey and orange peel. The hall table was set with a neat row of votives, and the black and white family portrait hovered above the console with the authority of a brand logo. Christopher came from the kitchen, folding his hand like an extra thumb, and gave Maggie a quick, distracted hug that pressed and released without quite landing. The children called hi from the living room without looking up. The television whispered a holiday special, and a game controller clicked in a steady rhythm. Emily appeared from the dining room, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a small relief blooming on her face as if her grandmother had brought a pocket of fresh air with her. Hi, Gran, she said, and the two syllables ran real. Hi, sweetheart, Maggie answered, and the word sweetheart felt like finding a chair in a too tidy room. The dining table stretched like a runway, the kind of surface that makes place look like art. Place cards stood at attention in slim brass holders. Maggie's name rested at the far end, next to a small sideboard crowded with serving pieces. Vanessa gestured with a gracious flick. We thought you'd be most comfortable here, close to the tea kettle, she said with a laugh that could not quite decide whether it was a joke. Christopher slid into his seat midway down the table, still skimming something on his screen. Vanessa took the central chair nearest the flowers, a spray of white lilies so fragrant the air seemed to tilt. Emily sat across from Maggie, angled to see both ends. The first courses arrived in careful order. A salad of jewel-bright pomegranate seeds and ribbons of fennel, a little plate of bread triangles, butter piped into perfect scallops. Conversation organized itself around Vanessa's voice. Work has been wild, she said, almost cheerfully. Fourth quarter targets, conversions, the whole roller coaster. Christopher chimed in about a new investment app, his sentences punctuated with glances at the phone. Emily asked a quiet question about scholarships. Vanessa fielded it with a quick promise to email a list. Mom, Vanessa said at last, turning to Maggie with a smile that gleamed like a polished spoon. What are you up to these days? Still into those small retiree hobbies? There was a soft ripple of laughter up the table, not unkind so much as unthinking. The sound of people flexing muscles they did not know they had. Maggie felt the old sting rise and pass as quick as a match. She reached for her water, kept her voice even. I keep busy, she said. I write, I walk, I cook. Vanessa lifted her glass. Nothing too strenuous then, she answered, as if congratulating everyone for staying on script. The main dishes arrived on warm plates, borne by Christopher with a competence that made him briefly present. Slices of turkey glossed with a careful glaze, roasted carrots laid in precise lines, a survey of greens that looked like a magazine had whispered approval over them. He placed a small plate before Maggie, beautiful as a picture, modest as a rumor, and moved on. Emily leaned forward. Gran, the tea you like is in the cabinet by the stove, she said softly. I can make you a cup after we sit. Maggie smiled and nodded, the gratitude quick and clean. Around them, talk kept its elegant clip. Investments and renovations. A January trip under consideration. A chef whose pop-up dinner had been impossible to get into and then worth the trouble. At intervals, one of the younger children would pitch a half sentence into the air. Watch this level, look, and the room would murmur approval without lifting its eyes. Maggie kept to her pace, tasted what was placed before her, and let the details do what details do when a person refuses to beg. The cool weight of the fork, the way the napkin's hem felt stitched, the tiny draft that found the back of her neck every time the kitchen door swung open. Midway through the meal, Vanessa performed a little flourish with a gleaming espresso machine set up on a rolling cart. This is the new love of my life, she announced, laughter framing the words. We finally upgraded. It is ridiculous how good it island. She busied herself with levers and steam, the wand hissing in a way that made the room sound briefly like a railway platform. Oat for me, almond for Chris, she said, then turned to Maggie with practiced warmth. And for you, oh, I remember you probably just a tea person. The line landed as lightly as a feather and felt, to Maggie, like a thumb pressed ever so slightly on a bruise. Emily's eyes flicked to her grandmother's face and then to her mother's hands. I can put the kettle on, Emily said, kind and quick. I know which mug. Vanessa waved a gracious permission. Perfect, she said. We all have our little comforts. Maggie watched the crema settle in Vanessa's cup, the foam art, a perfect heart that did not know it was being used for choreography. When dessert came, fig tarts on slender plates, a bowl of sugared cranberries that looked like Frost Vanessa steered the talk to plans. "We're thinking Europe in spring," she said. "Or maybe a New York weekend, just for us. You know, a little culture before Emily heads to college." She nodded down the table at Christopher, who smiled the smile of a man who had learned to show agreement with minimum effort. "Mom, you should travel too," Vanessa added, helium in her tone. "There are so many senior tours now, very manageable. You would love the bus guys." The words were balloons handed to a person who had not asked for any. Maggie set down her fork with care and felt the room focus and blur at once. She did not reach for a speech, she reached for stillness. "That sounds nice," she said, and the statement floated there, even and intact. Emily cleared her throat as if to mint a new subject. "Grant's writing is really good," she offered, the sentence simple and true. "She's been working on a winter piece." Vanessa nodded with keen approval but a faintly absent gaze. "A blog is sweet," she said, aiming the compliment like a ribbon on a box. "It is wonderful to keep the mind sharp." The younger child left the table to fetch another controller. The older one scrolled on a phone under the edge of a placemat, fingers flicking like minnows in a shallow stream. The lilies kept giving off their heavy sweetness. The teapot clicked once as its element idled. Maggie let the sounds braid themselves and did not move to untangle them. She looked along the length of the table and saw an arrangement that had no space for untidy truths, only for objects and words that fit. In that moment, quiet slid into her like a beam, not of ice, but of bone. If a person cannot change the room, she thought, she can change the way she stands inside it. She took another sip of tea, its heat steady and unshowy, and set the cup down so gently the saucer did not utter a sound. Christopher, perhaps feeling a draft of conscience, set his phone face down and asked how the drive had been. "The highway was kind," Maggie said. "The trees were handsome." He smiled like a man remembering a good line from a book, then drifted back toward the center of the table where the conversation promised easier grooves. Vanessa told a story about a client whose wife collected antique snow globes, and the table laughed in the right places. Maggie felt Emily's gaze again, a little golden tether across the white runner. It was not pity that traveled along it. It was recognition, quiet, and clean. Emily did not try to fill the gap with chatter. She anchored it with presence. Maggie folded her napkin once, then again, making a small square as neat as a thought you intend to keep. Plates were cleared in a tidy symphony. Vanessa's hostess energy softened into a satisfied glow. Christopher refilled water glasses with the uncommon grace of a man given a clear task. The children vanished upstairs like birds startled into flight. Maggie stood to help and was gently ushered back toward her chair. "We've got it," Vanessa said, still smiling. "You relax." The phrase was smooth as polished stone. Maggie Saturday. She placed her hands lightly on her knees and let her breath choose an honest pace. She owed no one a bright performance. She owed herself a steady center. In the quiet that followed the clearing, the house seemed to exhale, the windows blinking their necklace of lights back at their reflections in the dark glass. Night pressed itself to the panes and held there. Somewhere across the water a horn sounded, not loud, not urgent, a single note laid down like a bookmark. Maggie felt the ache from earlier lift and move aside, as if it had remembered an errand elsewhere. What remained was not triumph and not sorrow, but a grounded certainty that did not need to flash or announce itself. Emily rose to gather the dessert plates and paused by Maggie's shoulder, brushing a stray crumb into her hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. Maggie looked up at her granddaughter and saw in the young face a future that might yet learn to make a room that truly held people. The thought steadied her more than any speech could have done. She let the lamp's warm light pool in her eyes and did not blink it away. Maggie told herself, tomorrow they will see I'm no longer a shadow of myself. Morning lifted slow and bright over the water, angling through the living room windows until the tree glittered as if it had its own weather. Vanessa clapped once, cheerful and efficient, and the children slid to the floor, knees on the soft rug, hands ready. Paper began to tear in clean, eager sounds. the room filling with the soft thunder of ribbon and cardboard, that particular music of a day built around surprise. Maggie sat on the end cushion of the sofa, a place that gave her a view of everyone without putting her in anyone's way. She kept her hands folded lightly, palms warm against one another, letting the morning show itself without asking it to be anything it was not. Gifts made their way around the family in the kind of order that happens when people know the choreography. Christopher opened a golf bag with clean lines and clever pockets and held it up for approval. The room gave him a satisfied chorus. Vanessa peeled the lid from a pale box and lifted a designer handbag with a careful, rehearsed delight, as if the moment had been planned down to the angle of her wrist. The younger child crowed over a game. The older slipped a smartwatch onto her wrist and wiggled fingers, admiring the tidy glow. Phones came out and went away, photographs taken and captured again from better angles. The tree answered no questions and asked none. When the drift of presents thinned, Vanessa glanced around the base of the tree, her mouth making a small O of surprise that did not reach her eyes. "Oh," she said lightly, "with everything going on, I must have misplaced yours, Maggie." She let a laugh cushion the sentence and then reached to read a tag on another box, keeping the morning's rhythm from faltering. Christopher looked down into his coffee as if it had information he needed. The television offered a holiday choir at a polite volume. No one meant harm, not in the way we use the word mean, and yet the old draft found its seam and slipped under the door. Maggie felt it pass over her skin like a change in weather. She thought, without bitterness and without surprise, of the birthday long ago when the day had opened like a wide, empty road and had closed the same. She had learned since then what to do with blank spaces. She set her teacup carefully on its saucer, the ceramic making a small note like a tuning fork, and reached into the tote at her feet. Paper touched paper as she found the envelope she had placed there before leaving Portland, its corners squared and cool. She did not hurry. She laid it on her lap in a way that invited the room to notice but did not demand it. When the room did notice, it did so in stages. Emily first, her hat tilting slightly, then Christopher, blinking as if adjusting to a new prescription, then Vanessa, with her hostess smile holding firm. "I got myself something this year," Maggie said, the words so even they sounded like a kindness. She slid out a stapled packet and placed it on the coffee table, the pages fanning a little before settling. The top line held a title and a date printed in a plain, faithful font. Vanessa leaned with a brightness that read as interest and strategy at once. "What's this?" she asked, the question lifting as if it had helium in it. Maggie folded her hands in her lap again. "A summary," she said, "of a project I have been working on." She did not say more yet. She let their eyes move. She watched understanding arrive not as a single clan but as a sequence of clicks, small and undeniable. She named it when it was ready to be named. "It is my writing," she said. "A site I host, and a small shop attached to it. I call it Second Horizon." Vanessa's smile stayed bright. Christopher reached toward the stack, then paused as if waiting for permission. Maggie gave him a little nod. He lifted the corner of the first page and read just long enough for his eyebrows to step closer together. "It says," he began, and then stopped. Vanessa placed two fingertips on the paper, either to steady it or to feel it, as if numbers have a temperature. "All told," Maggie said, when no one moved to speak, "the audience is a bit over 90,000 readers. Most of them are women my age and a touch younger. It has been a comfort to them and to me. Last quarter, the income, after expenses, was just under $40,000. She did not look at anyone as the sentence measured itself across the coffee table and came to rest. She had practiced the line only once, not in the mirror but in her mind, making sure each word stood on its own 2 feet. Now that it was out in the air, it did not rattle. It joined the room's furniture and took up its proper space. Silence settled. A good silence at first, the kind that means people are catching up to the truth, and then the thinner one that means people are choosing what to do with it. The children's games quieted, the television choir held a note and resolved it neatly, unaware of the change in climate it had accompanied. Emily looked at her grandmother and then down at the packet and then back again, her expression not a question so much as a recognition that wanted to be tender. Christopher cleared his throat the way a man clears his throat when he has discovered a hallway in a house he thought he knew by heart. Vanessa recovered first because recovery was a language she spoke fluently. She laughed, delighted, and a little breathless. Well, my goodness, she said. That is impressive. We should talk about partnerships, about reach, about the brand story. There is a lot we could do together. Her voice gathered speed the way a river does when it finds a steeper grade. I have a newsletter list that would adore this. We could repackage, scale, manage the funnel, bring in sponsors. Maggie did not move toward or away from the enthusiasm. She reached back into her tote and brought out a small object that sat clean in the palm of her hand. A key on a simple ring. I also bought a place, she said. A 2-bedroom near the Pearl District. Good light, a quiet street. Close to the farmer's market. The key clicked gently when it met the table, like a tiny bell taking attendance. Vanessa's mouth opened and did not close right away. Christopher's eyes went to the key and then to his mother's face and then to the packet and then back again, as if trying to assemble a set from pieces that did not match the box picture. Maggie felt the old sorrow step aside and make room for something sturdier. It was not triumph. It was not scolding. It was the sensation of standing inside her own name and hearing it answer. Emily's hands had gone still in her lap. She looked at the pages again, her gaze bright as if the printed lines gave off light. Gran, she started, and the single syllable carried a great deal. Maggie turned her head a fraction, enough to let Emily know she had her full attention. The room, for a heartbeat, was only them. Vanessa recovered again, this time with strategy more than delight. It would be such a waste not to leverage this, she said quickly. We can meet after the holidays. I can pull in a friend who does digital branding for women-led projects. It would be a win for everyone. Family, you know. The word family floated there, haloed in proper sentiment and strangely weightless. Maggie's answer came in the shape of her posture before it came in words. She sat a little taller, shoulders soft but sure. I appreciate the interest, she said. And I am happy you finally know what my days have held. She let the next sentence stand alone, not to punish, but to clarify. I am not looking for a partner. The sentence did not have teeth. It did not need them. It had a spine. Christopher flinched so slightly it would have been easy to miss. Vanessa blinked as if someone had turned down a light and then remembered the dimmer switch. Of course, she said, voice brightening again. Of course, we can just brainstorm. No pressure. The words stumbled over themselves in their hurry to be reasonable. The room breathed. The house kept standing. The tree glittered as if its ornaments had noticed something right itself. Maggie folded the packet, closed with one gentle hand, slid the key back into her tote, and lifted her teacup. The morning had shifted, and it would not shift back. She felt the steadiness of that the way a person feels a train come to rest exactly at the platform line. She did not glance around to measure anyone's expression. She did not wonder who might be texting whom in another room later. She took another sip and let the heat find her balance. Christopher found his voice in the softer registers first. How long? He asked, and swallowed. How long has this been happening? His hands wanted to do something orderly. He straightened a coaster that did not need straightening. A while, Maggie said, not unkindly. Long enough to learn the worth of an hour. That answer seemed to ask a different question to sit down and wait its turn. Vanessa smiled with all the training of someone practiced in making an ending look like a beginning. Well, she said too brightly, this is all extremely inspiring. She clapped her hands once, small and controlled. Shall we do stockings? One of the kids cheered from the rug. The dog across the street barked in a rhythm that sounded like applause. And then, as if the morning had been holding its breath for this exact note, Emily leaned in closer to the table, her eyes wide and shining, and whispered, Grandma, did you really do all of this? The quiet that followed felt like a room changing its mind. Vanessa's smile held, then trembled, the way a stage light flickers before it steadies. She began again with talk of timing and opportunities, and the smart thing to do when a moment presents itself, and Christopher, out of habit more than conviction, nodded in the rhythm of agreement. Maggie listened without leaning in. She did not armor her face. She did not soften it either. She simply sat, the packet now closed beneath her fingertips, the tote resting by her shoe like a calm animal. When Vanessa suggested a meeting after the holiday, an email thread, a gentle plan, Maggie answered as if placing a small, honest stone on the table. She thanked them for their interest and said no. Not now. Not as partners. Not as a brand. Vanessa blinked the way people do when the script they were counting on has been changed without their permission. Christopher scratched at an invisible itch along the edge of a coaster and then looked up at his mother with something unguarded in his eyes, a weather pattern shifting after a long drought. He did not apologize. He did not defend. He only breathed a little deeper than before, as if air had suddenly learned how to do its work. The house recalibrated around them. The lilies seemed less loud. The tree adjusted its gleam and became, once more, a tree. In the softened space, Emily stepped closer, that golden thread between her and her grandmother tightening and warming. She asked, with a steadiness beyond her years, whether Maggie would show her how the writing worked, how the pages became posts, how an idea became a thing that could help a stranger somewhere far away. Maggie's yes arrived with more lift than volume. It sounded like a door opening toward light. Emily's shoulders dropped with relief, and she smiled, a real smile, unposed, bright as a struck match that does not burn but reveals. Practicalities returned, as they will. Dishes needed washing. The dog across the street barked twice at nothing and then decided the matter was resolved. Vanessa gathered plates with movements that were careful but sharper at their corners. Christopher carried a trash bag out to the bins and stood an extra moment on the porch as if the night might knock some sense into him. Maggie moved through the kitchen, making herself useful in the quiet ways that leave no fingerprints on a host's pride. Drying a bowl without comment, straightening a towel without fanfare, sliding a cooling rack closer to the window so steam could find escape. When Vanessa said, "Please, relax, we've got it," Maggie obeyed the letter of the request and the spirit of her own peace. She sat at the edge of the living room and watched the lights on the tree blink in their patient sequence, one after another, like a line of thoughts agreeing not to argue. By late afternoon, she had packed what little she had taken out. The guest room smelled faintly of detergent and lilies, borrowed air that would forget her by morning. Emily appeared in the doorway with a bookstore gift card Maggie pressed into her palm, a quiet vote of confidence wrapped in cardboard. Emily hugged her grandmother with both arms and stayed a heartbeat longer than politeness requires. "I meant what I asked," she said, voice low enough to be theirs alone. "I know," Maggie answered, and the words carried a future inside them. Downstairs, Vanessa stood with a dish towel she did not seem to know what to do with, and Christopher came in from the deck with coat on his sleeves. There were words available save, glossy words about drive carefully and let us know you got home fine, and everyone selected from that shelf. Maggie thanked them for the invitation and did not add any words that would lie. She kept her own pace back to the car. The toe strap settled into its usual place across her shoulder, the suitcase light enough to lift without a grunt. The air outside was clear and cold in the way that makes a person stand taller without thinking about it. She slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the ring they had made around her life. The engine turned, a soft hum, and the house receded in the mirror with a kind of relief that felt both gentle and exact. Traffic gathered and released, a tide behaving itself. Her phone trembled once in the console, and then again. Messages arriving like pebbles tapping a window. One from Vanessa, bright with exclamation points. One from Christopher, spare and careful. One from Emily, a single heart spelled out in words, because punctuation can be misread. Maggie did not open any of them. She let the car and the road decide their conversation. Two old friends who knew when to be quiet. The sky went the clean gray of a well-washed stone. She stopped at a station for gas and stretched in the small square of pavement between pump and hood, breathing the faint scent of winter and rubber and something like pine. The windshield welcomed a new clarity under the sweep of the squeegee. In the reflection, she found her own face, steady and unstartled, and nodded the way you nod to someone who has done what she said she would do. Back on the interstate, she set the cruise at a sensible speed and let the miles stack themselves into a neat, satisfying column. Trucks passed with long, patient exhalations. A car full of teenagers sang to a song that had been old when Maggie was young, their hands keeping time on the roof, and she smiled without moving her mouth. Home received her the way a book receives a bookmark returned to its place. She carried her bag inside and clicked on the lamp in the front room, and the familiar pool of light widened like a welcome. She turned up the heat 2 degrees, rinsed the mug, and set water on to boil. The house answered with its small orchestra. The heater's reliable hum, the kettle's growing insistence, the faint whisper of a draft that always found the same seam and never did any real harm. She changed into softer clothes and brushed her hair back with an economy that would have made Henry green. Then she sat at her desk, opened the laptop, and waited 2 breaths before touching the keys. Waiting those breaths was part of the ritual she had taught herself, a way to signal to the mind that what happens here deserves kindness and accuracy both. The post had been waiting in her drafts, spine straight, ready to stand. She read it once for sound, once for sense, and once for mercy. It told a story without naming names, the way a good map shows you a way through without drawing your house. It spoke about no gift on a morning built of gifts, about the quiet kind of forgetting that teaches a person to remember herself, about the work of making something steady that can hold even when a room will not. It did not scold, it did not beg, it simply told the truth and trusted the listeners to hear it. She fixed 1 comma, took out 1 word that had tried to be clever, and then placed her hands on either side of the keyboard for that last small pause that makes a click into a decision. When she pressed publish, the page leapt forward into the world as if it had been practicing a step. The screen refreshed, and the title settled at the top like a banner in the soft wind. She closed her eyes and let the little chorus of notifications begin, not rushing to count them, not pretending they did not matter. In the next room, the lamp held the dark at a comfortable distance. A neighbor's car door thudded gently. Footsteps crossed the porch. Someone laughed once, low and content, and then went inside. She made tea and carried it back to the desk and read the first few notes as they arrived, the way you taste a soup as it comes to a simmer. Some were a simple thank you. Some were a paragraph long, telling her about a mother in Ohio, a sister in Maine, a woman in Arizona who had thought she was the only one sitting in a kitchen waiting for the day to notice her. Maggie answered what she could and marked the rest for tomorrow, a promise that felt light and strong in her hands. She did not feel larger than her life. She felt exactly her size and exactly in it. Outside, the night coaxed the city into quiet. Inside, the small machine of her work kept time with the steady engine of her heart. She touched the photograph on the shelf and said, as if Henry were just in the next room, "We did all right today." Then she turned back to the screen, where the new post had already begun to find its people, and let the glow warm the soft bones of her face. She posted a new piece titled, "The Gift I Gave Myself." Comments poured in. "You wrote my story. 都服." In the stillness that followed her long journey home, Maggie's quiet strength became its own kind of light. She had walked through a season of old wounds and sharp dismissals, only to uncover a truth far greater than recognition from others, the knowledge that her worth was never theirs to grant or deny. What this story leaves us with is a gentle reminder that love, dignity, and justice often arrive not in grand gestures, but in steady, ordinary choices. The courage to say no when others seek to take, and the grace to say yes when a younger heart reaches out for guidance. Like a lamp glowing in a winter window, even the simplest act of kindness can steady us when the night feels longest. Take a moment to notice the quiet gifts around you, the small loyalties, the unspoken compassion, and if this story has touched you, consider passing that warmth along to someone who may be waiting in silence for the light.